be obvious to you, some might not be. The first principle is a little different. We actually install as important a right to communicate. Now, the right to communicate has been fiddled with in various forums. I remember when I first got involved in the International Institute of Communications about 20 years ago, some people were talking about a right to communicate as being the sort of right that the UN and others might deal with in international policy development. Never really got anywhere, but we finally put it in the principles. So our first principle is that citizens and organisations should be able to communicate freely, and where regulation is required, it should be the minimum needed to achieve a clear public purpose. So in that principle, we install a right to communicate and then reflect a broad approach to the limits of regulation in the light of that right. Again, I won't go through all the principles, but a couple of other interesting facts that have come out of this iterative process we've had with these principles, with the broader public. Access to a diverse range of services is kind of an obvious principle, but we've added, and the opportunity to participate in. So access and participation is obviously a bit of a development in traditional broadcasting policy, which didn't see participation as a particularly important objective, I think it's fair to say, in most ways. Innovation and competition are obviously important. We take a further step also in the area of Australian content. The whole framework of Australian content in broadcasting has been focused on outputs, quotas and so on. It's been focused on not inappropriately, on a level of Australian content in material which is broadcast. There is very little mention of the health of the mechanisms that produce that content. And there's been some fairly vigorous debates amongst, between regulator and government and within regulators, especially the ABA and the ACMA in the past, about how much the current rules about Australian content really were about industry development. Was it a policy, industry policy, or was it simply an output policy? Well, we're very clear about that. Local and Australian content should be sourced from a dynamic domestic content production industry. So that clearly is an industry development policy. Again, I won't mention the others. In terms of access to a range of content, we talk about platforms and services and devices, because devices are increasingly, as you're well aware, becoming often the centre and the focus of one's access to content. Services providers should provide the maximum transparency for consumers regarding their services and how they are delivered, which to some degree is a response to the inevitable confusion and complexity and impenetrable nature of often the delivery modes and delivery arrangements we have for audiovisual services. Yes, it's net neutrality, but it's also broader than that. It's about a recognition that people should know, have a right to know what is generating the conditions around which they get content. And we believe that's going to become an important issue in the future as platforms become more complex and interrelated. The other 10 principles, as I say, you can see on the website, but they are central to our thinking about how we might proceed in this area. In the process, we've begun to develop a recognition of some what we call big rocks that sit at the centre of a consideration of convergent media. And they appear in a paper that's now come out called the Emerging Issues paper, which again is on the website, and good if you would be very happy if you have a look at and comment on back to us. The big rocks as we see them at the moment, subject to further thinking, are the regulatory approach, a review of the whole approach to regulation in terms of frameworks. And there we're looking at the question of layering as against silos horizontal versus vertical. Current approach is vertical. Layering is a more digitally oriented approach. Traditional in telecoms, less so in other areas. The potential for that, and its potential on the whole question of licensing. Who do you license? Who do you put that obligation on? And more broadly, regulation in general. What happens to regulation if you turn the silo system of broadcasting, telecommunications and so on its side and have a different approach to the arrangement? Where do you put obligations for licensing and regulation if you have obligations? Competition, diversity and consumer protection, kind of obvious issues. In competition, one area which has come forward is this whole question of the licensing of content and its relationship to competition, an issue which the ACCC in recent times has been quite strong in its thinking, and it's something which we are muchly interested in as well. Australian content and local content, community expectations and standards, and that's one area where we link to work that Terry is doing. And then spectrum policy and management, given so much content in media and telecommunications runs through the electromagnetic spectrum, obviously how one regards at the top policy level the management and allocation of spectrum is important, as is that particular part of spectrum which still remains in the traditional broadcasting bands, the so-called sixth channel. That channel, that multiplex, digital multiplex, which remains pretty much unallocated beyond the three commercials and the ABC and SBS, is an issue that we will be thinking about in terms of recommendations to government about how it might use and allocate that capacity. Now, in our processes so far, an initial consultation on the terms of reference, a paper on the principles that might apply, which I've talked about, a paper on the big rocks, the emerging issues that we see as really important, and the response we've had, which has been pretty good. We've had about 150 responses to those papers in formal response, and lots of online, Twitter, Facebook response, which has been very useful and important for us. I think it's fair to say, though, on behalf of my colleagues, that we're impressed by the depth of analysis of the problem that researchers, the general public, players in the industry have, and especially their ability to demonstrate how the current regime is causing them problems. We have had less solutions. Everyone knows the problem of convergent media. Not so many people have thought much about alternatives, and that's something that we've seen develop from the dialogue we've had so far with the community and with the industries involved. Another thing that's emerged is some of the principles and frameworks that already exist behind the current circumstance, but are not really overt and are not talked about much. But when you begin to pick apart what we have at the moment, before we think about new alternatives, these underlying principles become more obvious, and I believe they're seriously under-researched and are not sufficiently analysed in terms of the past or indeed the future. Some examples. Sectoral diversity. If there's one thing that Australia has done in the world in broadcast and media which is relatively unique, it has been the creation of three strong sectors in broadcasting. A national sector, the ABC and SBS, a commercial sector, and a community sector, and kept a balance, an ecology between those sectors over a long period. And of course, two of those, the national sector and the commercial sector, have really existed since day one, since 1928. And that's been a bit unique. In Europe and the United Kingdom until the 60s, there was simply the national sector. In America, of course, there was simply the commercial sector. In Canada, there's simply been the Americans. Everyone's had complexities. But we've had for a long time, and we've built and developed it, this recognition that the way you can build in diversity, even before you look at the number of players and so on, is to have broadcasting and media services done from a different starting point. From the point of public service, from the point of commercial success, from the point of community participation. And the community sector in Australia, in radio especially, as many of you know, is very strong and very passionate and very important. And yet we rarely look at the sectoral nature. And one of the questions for the Convergence Review, if there's some wisdom in that approach, what does it tell us about what we can do in the future? Are there more sectors to add to that structural diversity factor which can be built in, for example? We don't know the answers. We're in listening mode at the moment, but we ask the questions. Independence in media and communications, a principle which formed the basis of organisations like the ABC, and by independence I mean arm's lengthness from government. But a principle which is not well understood more broadly these days. Does a regulator need to be independent from government, even though it's a government regulator? If so, what does that mean? What should the rules be about that? Some years ago there was a piece of work done called the URI report, which was done into the structure of government agencies. And it basically came out at the end of the day by saying, if you're a government agency and you make money, you should have a board and have a structure intersecting into government roughly like a commercial operation. If you are an agency and you don't make money, then basically you should work to the minister. You may have an advisory board, but you should work to the minister. There was no consideration in this national piece of work of that great third area where distance from government is important, and that is the area of government's relationship with culture and information. And if the history of the 20th century tells us anything, the rivers of blood of the 20th century is that there needs to be distance between the control of culture and communications from government. And yet this report came out without mentioning it. And the poor old Department of Communications, Information Technology and the Arts at that stage had to virtually carry the whole burden of convincing government at that time that there was this third category, and the cultural institutions that sat within it, including mine at the time, the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, really needed to have a proper distance from government because of the nature of what it did. So the concept of independence being within government but independent from the government of the day is something that I think still has enormous importance, and it's often not recognised. Other issues, co- and self-regulation, the extent of that, how that can develop, its limits, the regulation of electronic platforms in relation to print platforms, are not unimportant issue in the current environment. What is the scope of legislation in electronic platforms? Why do we regard them differently to print platforms, newspapers? What is the reasons, the background, the history, the purpose and the policy settings for that? Free media versus paid media, the amount of commentary which tends to equate free-to-air broadcasting exactly with online broadcasting without recognising the point that at least to the user, at the point of reception, free broadcasting is free. Online broadcasting is not free, and that is a significant public fact. And there are a range of others I won't mention because of time, but there are a whole lot of presuppositions, not in legislation in particular clear forms, which drive our current system and which we're trying to winkle out to see how they're relevant in the future environment. Just very quickly, we have 2 papers out.